Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. This is William of Applied Virtue, and here with me today is not our guy, aka Hitler hated Christ. Uh, hello there. What would you prefer to be called? Uh,
Oh, honestly, I mean, it's a mouthful, so you can just call me Hitler, frankly.
please don't, please don't.
No, no, no. You could like HHC is fine, not our guy. Either of those, or if you just want to say it full out, Hitler hated Christ, that's fine.
Okay. HHC, I
Yeah, I
guess.
was kind of hoping my at would catch on more than my actual title of my account when I first created it, but it's since become an abbreviation. But HHC also is hard to say, so I'm kind of
Yeah,
screwed, I guess, on all that.
yeah. So not our guy. Why don't you tell my audience a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, so I originally started a Twitter account. I don't even know if it was a full year ago now. I think it might have been like middle of last year. Um, because I had lots of different conversations with white nationalists and people on the dissident right about theology and the implications of nationalism, and then even further fascism, and then also specifically like the Nazi ideology, um, and all the theological implications that come with all that. And I really started looking into the topic more. I read books by Dr. Weirkar, which I based the main thread on my Twitter page around. Read some alternative views by some, oddly enough, Jewish atheists who disagree with my perspective, that Nazism is incompatible with Christianity. And I found it so interesting and something that I had never seen online before presented in this space that I wanted to get it out there, and I wanted to kind of get my perspective through these authors into the consciousness online on the right. And so I just started making this giant pin thread, which I'm not sure if it has 100, things in it yet, but it's pretty dang long. And I just started compiling sources and quotes by Hitler through various different means to prove the case and the premise of my account, which is that Hitler hated Christ. There's some people that have contention that he didn't necessarily hate Christ, but that he just wasn't a believer, which, again, I think that's totally fine to believe. But I was mostly focusing on a political sect on the right that seemed to be very pro Nazi, pro Hitler, while also simultaneously claiming to be Christians. And I felt like that contradiction had not been investigated enough. And so that's why I made my account and started having arguments online.
I've certainly had a few arguments online. Uh, certainly. With these kinds of people. Uh, is that the real Dave the Distributist
Oh, I
in the
think it
chat?
is. I think it is Dave. Hey, Dave.
This is a troll. Well, I don't real like.
I'd
Is
love
this?
I'd love to talk to you sometime, Dave, if you're willing.
Oh wow, it is Dave. I didn't. I mean, this is an honor. But yeah, I mean, Dave is just looking out for me because um, I have been burned by people. He's been burned by people before. I've been burned by people before. Um, it's certainly a it's cer- uh, it's certainly something that I wanted to address here first and foremost. I this is a chance for you. This is I mean, there's a reason why I said that this was a controversial chat because there's a lot of people out there who think that you are a troll, that you are operating in bad faith. I don't know. It, I personally might. I mean, I haven't gotten that impression of you, but I've been told that I'm a bad judge of character. So, I mean, it would take a little bit more, but I'm my view is that you should give people the benefit of the doubt. Um,
Well, I guess it comes down to like what if like especially with the term subversive. It's like what does that mean? Do I want to subvert a certain type of ideological viewpoint that I think is contradictory on the right? Yes. Does that mean I want people to stop being on the right? No, I'm on the right. There may be some disagreements on, like, I guess, how far on the right I am compared to every other person I talk to in politics, pretty much, who are not white nationalists. I'm very far to the right. Um, so the question then becomes, like, at least in terms of my intentions with the account, is why do I have to be ascribed some type of nefarious motives, right? I mean, I do use my account in probably ways that are more infighting than just attacking the left all the time, but that was also because I got so tired of my Twitter timeline consisting almost entirely of just anti SJW copy paste takes all the time, right? I mean, like, do we really need another person to, retweet and joke about the most recent, like, blue-haired feminist or whatever?
Mhm.
It was just boring to me. And I had much better and interesting conversations around theology, and then specifically around theology in the dissident right, and how our beliefs about Christ and God should, be shown to the world in politics as people in the right wing. And so that was why I made my account. It wasn't because it was like trying to. Again, I don't even know what the intention would be. Make people vote not Republican, or make people not racially conscious, or something. I don't
Well, I
know.
mean, it's just, I mean, a troll is just like someone who stirs up controversy. There are several people that Dave and I have met in the past that, they start out looking like, oh, we're just well-meaning critics of right-wing wingers, but then they turn into, it turns out that they're kind of these concerned trolls who, when you scratch the surface, they turn out to be very nefarious people. And I'm not going to name names here, but it has happened to me. It's happened to Dave, and I think there's a lot of people who are very paranoid about that. That's I don't think that's a very good mindset. But I'm not going to judge people who have it simply because it might be prudent. I don't know. It's just I just think it's kind of a shame because it closes off a lot of avenues for discussion.
Yeah, I would say if you were trying to build a political coalition, and part of your political coalition um, dreams were that you wouldn't have someone, um, I guess, speak up when when they thought something was theologically wrong or immoral,
I
then
don't
I'm
think
probably
that.
not. Probably
I,
shouldn't be in those groups, I guess.
well, I mean, it really it well. I guess. So, is this what you would see yourself as doing? As pointing out, you were just pointing out, hey, these things that you're saying, they're not theologically correct. Is
Yeah,
that
mostly. Yeah, I mean, that's most of what I do on my Twitter account, is that. And there's obviously some, like, comedic tongue in cheek, and I do think that there are a significant amount of people on the dissident right who have isolated themselves socially, and because they're not also willing to be forthright for some good reason in a more public sphere with their opinions, they don't get really called out when they make statements and say things that are just extremely socially odd, and a lot of the, like, very neo-pagan might makes right stuff, I think, deserves to get ridiculed to a degree. But most of my non comedic stuff on Twitter is focused around clarifying theology, trying to decide which political positions and desires are aligned with Christ's character, which things need to be left behind, and sort of trimming the fat off of the more nationalist and populist side of the right, which has a lot of stuff baked into it that has theological implications I don't think people have considered.
mm, okay? I guess what are some of the theological implications that you've what are some of the assumptions that you've criticized that have theological implications that Christians should really take seriously, in your opinion?
Yeah, glad you asked, Will. So one of the biggest ones I think would be, at least more recently, would probably be on the topic of personal forgiveness and whether or not personal forgiveness should be something that is celebrated when done publicly and in an honest fashion. There was a situation not too long ago where Pedro Gonzalez and Aaron, I think it's McIntyre from the
Oren
Blaze.
McIntyre, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Oren, is it Oren, not Aaron? Okay,
Yeah,
whatever.
Oren McIntyre.
Oren McIntyre from the Blaze. There was some back and forth about a specific case where a woman's child was attacked in Mall of America and almost died. And she came out later, years later, and in an interview stated that she publicly forgave the man that did that. And from my perspective, this wasn't undermining the process of justice. The actual justice system in the United States served its purpose. Should it have given him more time than he did, or should he have gotten the death penalty? Perhaps. But her response in a public interview had no influence on that case. And so when she was asked about this, she cited her faith. She said, "I forgive him." I didn't really hold that mom in that interview to a super high standard of theological conciseness because she's just a random woman who's a believer. But I was kind of shocked to see a lot of people who considered themselves Christian nationalists dragging this woman and claiming that she was being unchristian and that forgiveness was not. I think the
I
exact quote by Pedro was that there's nothing Christian about forgiving someone who tries to murder your son, right? And I thought that was a pretty clear contradiction that should have been called out. And it resulted in some good discussion, I think, on the right in those circles on Twitter.
Okay. So you point. I think I remember that episode. You pointed out you pointed to the example of Christ. Um, Christ asking his Father to forgive the people persecuting them because they know not what they do.
Right. And then also like Stephen similarly does that when he's being stoned, right? Um, I mean, and even the whole idea of not forgiving your enemies when while we were enemies, as it says in Scripture, Christ died for us, very much flies in the face. And what my that was I guess my argument with Aaron and Pedro. What it came down to with me and Dave, and I wish we could have discussed this more publicly, was surrounding in public when asked by the media whether or not you disclose that you have forgiven someone. And my perspective was, especially if it doesn't have any impact on the justice system in that case, it's totally acceptable and should be lauded to use that scenario as a witness of Christ-likeness. And I think that's what that woman was doing. And I'm not even saying that it's a moral imperative that when asked by the media, you have to share that. But I'm saying if you do share that, that isn't something that somebody should be criticized for doing.
Hmm. Okay, so what did you so I think that a lot of people and this is someone I would include myself in this somewhat because I'm sympathetic to this view. A lot of people um they look at these kinds of public displays of groveling
Yeah,
that you see especially after the George Floyd
yeah,
uh, ri- uh, the George Floyd debacle,
yeah,
and the you see these public displays of groveling about America's, saying I'm sorry for America's sins of white supremacy. You see the kinds of I think you see a lot of people go around and say that you're oh we can I will forgive I'll forgive like this black person for this crime, and then you know later on that person gets killed, and you see this in the media over and over and over again. I think a lot of times what comes strikes what two thoughts come across in your mind. One, a lot of this seems very performative, and number two, a lot of this seems to be very unwise, imprudent, and also in some ways it's a betrayal. because it's one thing to sacrifice yourself for Christ. It's
Right.
another thing to sacrifice another person, and
Absolutely.
especially like your family member for Christ.
Absolutely.
That is. I think you can understand the difference, and I think this is one of the things that people like Pedro and Oren they see this as um, this is just this act of piety. It's the kind of piety where you you take money away, you sell your children into slavery so that you
Right.
can give that money to the church. Type. It's that kind of false kind of piety that Christ criticized with the Pharisees, and
Right.
I think that's. I think, and I think I don't think that's. And the thing is, I don't think that Oren and others would necessarily um, they would necessarily blame the woman for thinking this, but they think that this is a kind of bad view of Christianity that has been instilled into people
Yes.
to perpetuate some kind of malevolent agenda.
Yes. So I would agree, and I share a level of disgust when it is done in the fashion that you described. I think you steel man their concerns really well. However, at least in the circumstance where this came up, as well as some others that have been discussed, I believe that because we are very sensitive to the sort of performative forgiveness cloaked in Christianity, which is false and is not biblical, that we have at the same time forgotten the true value of Christ-like forgiveness. And I think in the situation of this mother, that's what happened. I mean, for instance, there's a verse, Matthew 24:12, and it says, and this is talking about the end times and all that, and it says, Christ says, and because lawlessness is increased, or in this time wickedness would be multiplied, the love of people will become cold, right? And I think that's kind of what we're seeing is we're no longer looking at these individual situations and saying, oh, this is performative. Either this is a pastor out there kissing the feet of a black man because he's getting on the news, right? And we're not making a distinction between that and then a mother who, she on her own has no impact on this case and justice being served, publicly, being Christ-like. And I don't think that that woman in that scenario deserved that critique. And I think lots of people are getting caught up in that process. And I also think one of the things Dave's mentioned, which was interesting, was that he doesn't want to concede the language war with the left. But I believe that's what he's doing because I don't believe that that the left has a monopoly on forgiveness. I don't think that we should concede that word to them, where if someone says, I forgive so-and-so on a personal level, that we have to view that as, okay, well, that's capitulation. You must want, all of these people to go out and like cause harm to other people and not have any, ramifications and, any punishment by the state, right? That's not what I'm saying. That's not what she was saying. But because we have become so sensitive to that, with some good reason, I feel like we are actually calling Christ-like behavior evil, which I think is a problem. Um,
Well, certainly, what you will find um, in with when you have some kind of I guess when you have these kinds of uh, sins, vices, heresies, they tend to come in pairs. Or one is being a vice of deficiency, and the other being a vice of excess. And both are, and one is the one that comes after is usually an attempt to rectify the first one. And that might be what we're seeing here. That um, like you said, you see that I think one of my first video on my channel, my first edited video on this channel was talking about the vice of complacence, which is the opposite. It's a vice of excessive friendliness. So Christians and people of goodwill are meant to be friendly in our speech to one another. Um, and so aren't supposed to be like these kind of crabby, antisocial people because we want social interactions to be generally pleasant. But at the same time, we can't make that our focus because there are more important things like the truth. And if you have to say something controversial or harsh to someone else in order to get across the truth to them in charity, then you have to forego that kind of friendliness in order to say that. And the people who are complacent, people who are too friendly, are like the kinds of people who will help you off a cliff. You know what I mean? And I think that's something similar is happening here, where on the one hand, you have this extreme complacence in our society where people are expected to be overly forgiving, overly friendly, uh, very effeminate. And so there's this natural desire for a radical pushback to this. And sometimes becomes, it goes outside the bounds of normal friendliness into the opposite vice.
Yeah, I think that I would say that we are in danger of an excess of a lot of things in our culture today. I wouldn't say um, that genuine forgiveness is in excess. I would say that the sort of performative forgiveness is probably always wrong, but it's definitely in excess. I'm not sure that I could imagine a scenario just because of human nature, frankly, where there were too many people on an individual personal level, again, aside from the state itself and punishment, being willing to forgive those who harmed them, right? That seems like, at least in the terms of Christ, that forgiveness was boundless. But that was a genuine forgiveness, not some type of performative forgiveness, and it wasn't a capitulation either. And I think that's another important distinction: is that true, genuine forgiveness is not a capitulation to evil.
Well, yeah, exactly. I think it all boils down to the will, right? Because if you are genuinely forgiving, that is something motivated by charity, and charity cannot lead is a virtue. It cannot lead you towards evil. Um, the the but when you have this performative forgiveness, um, this kind of performative forgiveness or capitulation, it does not come from a good place, generally speaking.
Right,
Uh,
exactly.
it's generally comes from an some of the now somebody might be the only scenario I can think of where it might come from a good place is if this person honestly believes that, oh well, Christ says to forgive people and not judge people, and therefore I'm going to do this. I'm going to just let be a pushover and let people walk all over me. But that doesn't. That's not. That's never been. That's so against normal human nature that
Right.
it.
Exactly. And you think about this too. That other thing that I think has really perverted the conversation around this on the right has been the racial component, where, which is sad because there are multiple instances, and I posted one of these the other day, of black people doing the exact same thing when their family members were either killed by police officers or when they were killed by, in the case of the Oklahoma City bombing, white supremacists or white nationalists, right? And the thing is, if you look at those cases, the black communities, even the supposedly Christians in those black communities, oftentimes were attacking those people. So it's not. This is not something that's just restricted to the racial component one direction. This is like a deeper misunderstanding of this. And when we only view it through the lens of the racial struggle, we're really missing out on the true theological implications, I think.
Right. Right. Are there any other assumptions that you find that have theological implications that a lot of right wing Christians are not really thinking about?
Yeah, I think when we start to move from the territory of things like um, genetics and intelligence and move into the territory of genetics and ethical behavior, we start to get into some scenarios that I think are at least tricky. Not that they necessarily that we have to avoid them, obviously, but they have a lot more theological implication than I think people realize. Because people do generally on the right, the dissident right especially, will throw around proclamations about different racial groups and their either moral or immoral behavior, and that being based strictly on genetics. And so I think a deeper conversation on okay, how do we believe that people's predispositions genetically affect their behavior, and how does that interface with the soul, and things like that. Now, as somebody more reform leaning, I have some different thoughts on that, and I have some contradictions in my own thinking, just because it's difficult to see how this would all work within a framework of free will. But the reality is that people are not thinking that when they make a lot of these statements on the dissident right and claim to be Christians. But there are clear theological implications if we start to tie sinful behavior to something like your genetics, and then also begin to be, increasingly biologically determinist.
Well, certainly, of the kind of hard biological determinism is out, because that doesn't leave any room for um, human behavior to be influenced by things outside of the material. And you and I would both agree, even if we disagree on maybe questions of free will, you and I would both agree that God moves our souls, that our souls move us, because and our souls aren't material things. Um, so there's a lot of these kinds of fact that have to factor into what we're talking about, right? And I think the hard line determinism doesn't seem to work there. But now, the funny thing is that our theologians don't seem to have a problem about this when it comes to like genetic determinism of sin on an individual level. Like for example, I think I've never heard of a theologian having trouble with the fact that certain people are more genetically predisposed to alcoholism or say homosexuality.
Right. So very good point. So in terms of just a genetic predisposition, I agree, and I think that's much less of a conflict. Where you get into some more fishy territory, and this actually segues pretty well into the topic around the Hitler and the Nazi stuff. Um, you begin to see, as people present their views on these topics, how they rank order people's behavior and influences, and really, if redemption makes somebody a new creation. So, for instance, with the case of Jewish people during Nazi occupation, there were lots of different propaganda that was pushed that had the tagline of "baptism did not make him a non-Jew." And so the point was that, and very clearly proclaimed, that at least according to the Nazi ideology, your genetic background, and no, yes, genetic strictly, I don't, not religiously, your genetic background of being Jewish could not be overcome through a conversion. That your baptism and redemption did not actually make you a new creation that should be considered, but that your genes in and of themselves meant that you were evil and eternally damnable there. Um, and so that would be an example of where you'd see that, and you do see some sort of like twinges of that on different parts of the right wing, more of it in more pagan spheres, which I don't interact with a ton just because I don't have any shared presuppositions. But if somebody proclaims to be a Christian and then goes out and makes a statement like that about the salvation of Jewish people or something like that, I begin to wonder why they seem to have their priorities disordered, if that makes sense.
Well, certainly, yeah. I would definitely um, I would definitely question any Christian who believes that. Although I've never seen a Christian who has. Most of the people who believe that tend to be either atheists or pagans.
Yeah, you're right. I would say that there's a growing amount of people in the proclaim or people who proclaim to be Christians on the right who do make statements in that way, and I do talk to some of them on Twitter occasionally. I mean, you can even see some of my I don't not this topic specifically, but some of my other interactions with Corey go down this path also, and I think that the danger of those two worlds coming together is that we will actually place the material genetic conditions over the spiritual reality, and in terms of how we order our priorities.
Right, right. Yeah, that is something to consider. I think the right balance is to say that we can say that um, people's genetics can create a kind of disposition in the body towards certain acts, and certainly a person's culture would can create it can cause people to be more predisposed to commit certain sins or have certain moral views that are problematic for a Christian view. But when you, I don't think a Christian can say that because of our genes, we can never be truly Christian or redeemed in any way. I think that is off the table.
Yeah, and what I would say too is that even if somebody did concede that you could be, anyone could be saved despite of their genetics, you still leave the possibility of some people saying something akin to, because of genetics, this person is inclined to be deceptive, and so therefore we could never believe them if they claim to be a Christian. And so that could also be something that I haven't, or is something that I've encountered a few times, with the Jewish stuff, that can also seriously disrupt the harmony between believers, and I think is a pretty clear example also of placing the material realities over the spiritual consequences.
All right. Well, I mean, fair enough. I can see where you're going with that because, you know, I think that comes down to the kind of paranoia that you and I were talking about earlier in a different context. Because just like people are paranoid about whether someone's public confession of forgiveness is genuine, is a lot of people in the past and even in the present are paranoid over whether someone's conversion to Christianity is genuine. I don't think that's really as much of a problem now as it was back in the day,
Oh, of
simply
course.
because simply because you know a lot of the people who converted into Christianity under false pretenses did so because Christianity was dominant, politically dominant, and so they wanted to fit in, and so they might have had this kind of
What an
half-hearted
what an
conversion.
interesting scenario. I can't imagine anyone ever just tacking Christianity onto their political beliefs to fit in and be seen as valid, right? Can't imagine that ever
Well,
happening
oh,
anywhere.
wow. I mean, I think, though the idea within Christianity that by your fruits you shall know them is pretty apt here. I think,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely.
it's the when you look at like what they're doing and what they're preaching and how they behave in their daily life, um, I think that's it becomes more apparent what how dedicated they are to Christianity. Even if because you know I think that a lot of these people when they convert and they have that half-hearted conversion, what you tend to find is that they're not very good at living out the actual Christianity. they're very good. They can be very good at telling people they should be doing in a very concerned trolley way, but actually living it out is not something that they're good at, because it can be difficult. It's difficult to live out Christianity if you don't have God's grace.
Absolutely. Well, it's impossible. I mean, so
I mean,
yeah,
you have to be some kind of philosophical zombie, I believe,
yeah,
to be
exactly.
like to have this kind of perfect outward behavior that doesn't reflect your inward character at all.
Right,
You have
and
to
it's
be
also
incredibly good at deceiving people. It's like, oh man.
exactly.
I mean, at that point, if you have someone that perfect at deception, then they're going to be good at infiltrating any place.
Well, and this is why taking these conversations to the theological level rather than just the political or tactical level is important. So for instance, like with my big thread on the Hitler stuff, I've noticed so much more emphasis is placed by my detractors upon the regime itself and statements made by Hitler publicly that explicitly endorse Christianity and things like that. Whereas if I start to question other statements made by Hitler in public speeches, like saying things like the Volk alone is our Lord, saying that his conscience has one commander and that's the Volk, saying that the voice of the Volk is the voice of God, right? I mean, those are statements that I see as very clear indications that Hitler was, just on a theological level, not a Christian. There's just no theological basis for that at all. But people don't want to assess it on that level. They seem, my detractors especially, they seem to want to just assess it from a simplistic political tactical perspective. And when you do that, you come away with some false views of these periods of history and these people, and you end up saying some ridiculous things.
Yeah, that is something. Yeah, I can't disagree with you there. It's just it's a very iffy issue because on the one hand, that it's very clear in earlier times that people often would generalize on the basis of like a race or a culture. They would say things like, "Oh, this people is corrupt," or "This people it suffers from this vice," and so on. And 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 you see this very opposite notion within modern liberalism, where they would look back on that and say, "Well, that's obviously means that you're a bad person. They're just all bad people. They're all just bigots because they're generalizing," as if people in modern times don't generalize to entire groups like that all the time. I think it's just if you have a group of people who are connected like that and tend to do certain things, I think it's justified to generalize on some level while recognizing that not every individual person in that group is going to conform to the generalization. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that there can't be forgiveness, there can't be redemption, and there can't be charity, quite frankly.
Right, and you have to be able to have, like, we've got to be mature enough to be able to have conversations that speak in generalities without constantly having to second guess our language and clarify. But not all X or not all Y. I mean, that's pretty obvious, you know. I mean, even when discussing things like homosexual behavior, something that progressive air quotes Christians do often is when you talk about homosexual sin and speak in generalities about homosexuals, you get a response of like, okay, well, what about the homosexual who does not, doesn't want to be acting homosexual or doesn't want to have homosexual desires and is living celibate lifestyle? It's like, well, yes, but when I refer to homosexuals, it's assumed just because we're having a conversation in this context that I'm not talking about that person necessarily. And so I get what your point is on that, and that's definitely the case. It's the sinfulness of it does not actually come from the just the generalities and the fact that we're talking about people as groups. That's pretty obvious given how many times also in the Old Testament it will refer to, wicked people. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's very obvious within these in groups, and sadly, um, this kind of nuance is sort of lost in modern culture, where you just have two sides. It's either you are one of the you are either like Father James Martin or you're Corey Mailer.
Right, exactly right. That's some of the problem I think with even just the way that we have the internet and the way that we interact with people online structures it where people who are either no matter who they are and what their views are, if they are offensive to a certain large amount of people, they get more traction. And I totally attribute my account getting views to that as well. So I partake in that. But the reality is, it does kind of screw up that understanding of like the individual versus the group, and like what kind of takes or how edgy your takes should or can be.
Well, speaking of takes that are edgy or should be, like what exactly is your political position? Because I've heard you when I shared with you the distributists clip criticizing you on one of his live streams, you took offense to the fact that he called you a normie con.
Yeah, I don't
Uh,
like that.
what is your understanding of normie conservatism and what is wrong with it in your view? And
Yeah, I mean,
how would you distinguish yourself from that?
I would say that like normie conservatism and like kind of sort of like barstool conservatism are kind of similar. Barstool is a little bit trashier. But my view on immigration is to totally freeze it, regardless of where they're coming from for an extended period of time or indefinitely. That's something that I disagree with conservatives on. I think that we need to have a state that's explicitly Christian and not secular with Christian undertones. I think we should bring back legislation against sodomy. I think we should be actively prosecuting people who propagate sexual depravity. I think pornography should be illegal. There's a lot of things that I believe that normicon Christians, or I guess like Fox News watchers or whatever we want to call them, would disagree with me on. I think even my acknowledgement of some of the scientific basis for race is also something that I would have a big disagreement with normie conservatives on. So again, somebody just said boomerism in the chat. I don't know. Maybe it's boomerism. Maybe it's just like one generation pre-modern normicon. I guess that's fine. But I think that my positions are fairly defensible. I would say that I'm not a fan of democracy either, which is something that I probably wouldn't share with most conservatives. I think we should have an extremely limited democratic system if we were to have one at all, probably restricted to people who would fit the biblical qualifications of deacons. I think that, I think men who are leaders of their households should vote. The age requirement should probably be above 30. They should probably have to have children to participate in the electorate process, things like that.
That's very interesting. Some very interesting perspectives there. Um, I imagine that you would agree with me a lot about um, the reasons why liberalism and by liberalism I would include blah, sorry, classical liberalism too is problematic from a Christian perspective.
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely. There's lots of different issues with that. I mean, one of the biggest ones would be the idea that we can have a state that is morally upstanding, but also totally secular. That's just like a joke to me, given, I mean, and you can see this even through if you have a basic understanding of apologetics and like the moral argument. It's like we know as believers, and I think that even people who are not believers, a lot of them acknowledge this, that like you cannot have an objective right and wrong without some type of metaphysical belief. You just can't do it. And so I don't know why we think our state can, but it's while acknowledging that it's philosophically not possible. That's one big issue I'd have with
Mm.
with classical liberalism.
Ah, I see. Yeah. And that's also, something that a lot of classical liberals don't understand is that a lot of their assumptions have political, moral, and theological implications that they don't really take into account. Like they'll just adopt things and they'll justify it using a very pragmatic or utilitarian idea, or they'll just say, well, we have to do this in order to be inclusive and or whatnot. But really, when you look at the implications of what they're saying, it's very radical and controversial, even. Most people would not accept classical liberalism, I think, if they knew what kind of the implications of classical liberalism were, such as, for example, theological minimalism, the view that we don't really know much about God at all or divine revelation. That was explicit within John Locke's argument for religious freedom. His view is that um, we have religious conflict because we can never know much about God or what the true religion is, and therefore we should have just religious freedom. And a church, it's just like a gathering of people who happen to agree on theology, and so
Right.
it should be subject to the state since it's a free association. It's like this is all implicit within these kinds of liberal ideas of religious tolerance and secularism.
Right, and funnily enough, when you read a lot of the classical liberals like Locke, like you're talking about, the way they talk about and try to act as if morality is objective without having a Christian underpinning or basis is found in their repeated appeal to the idea of like natural. And I don't mean like natural law biblically, I mean like just natural behavior in nature, right? And oddly enough, that's a correlate with things that that Hitler believed privately. You know, when he talks about right, morality and right and wrong, he very often appeals strictly to a sort of materialistic, naturalistic framework that he shares with classical liberals. And I think that's ironic given how many people are on the dissident right are pro Hitler and also simultaneously would hate or would say that they hate the ideological underpinnings of classical liberalism.
Well, yes, because you know things like there's a great um, guy. I mean, I would say he's great. I don't know if a lot of people would say he's great, but he's a very friendly guy. His name is Zoltanus, and he would personally consider himself a fascist. Um, and but he and I disagree on a lot, obviously, because I do not like that ideology. And he gives some very good reasons as to why in his essays. Because in his essays, he points out all of the kind of the socialist roots of that ideology, how it was rooted in a lot of the same assumptions of socialism and these kinds of enlightenment principles, but they were sort of they took some of the ideas and turned them on their head.
Right.
And
I mean,
but
even like Bormann, a Nazi, like a quote by him, and he was placed into the chancellery by Hitler. He says, National Socialist and Christian views are irreconcilable. The Christian churches are based on people's ignorance. On the other hand, National Socialism builds on a scientific foundation, right? And so that plays into what you're talking about the sort of the shared materialist framework that these different views are operating under.
so it's kind of funny that you talk about this, because I will say that when you I think that it seems like the main people, besides the kinds of Christians that you're talking about, who claim that Nazism and Christianity are compatible, or in fact they lead into one another, are, besides the Christians that you talk to, the only ones who say this are the kind of secular liberal types that you see often.
Right.
You see the new atheists talk about this. I've also seen academics talk about it. I have studied history a lot. I studied history in the academy in college, and a lot of the books that they will assign to you about this subject, they all say things like, you know, this kind of national socialism is just a natural, logical outgrowth of Christianity, which is such an odd thing when you look at their at the space assumptions. But then you realize that these people are looking at it almost exclusively from like a kind of racialist perspective, and so
Right.
they say that, because Christians didn't like Jews and National Socialists didn't like Jews for similar reasons, therefore one logically led to the other.
Right, exactly. And I mean, this is the whole irony of the fact that people who disagree with the premise of my account, who claim to be Christians, are on the same team as people like Richard Carrier, who are hardcore new atheists who don't believe that Christ existed at all as a, even a person. Um, and it also makes sense that both of those people, Carrier and then my other detractors who claim to be believers, who disagree with my account's premise, would not see why saying something like "my conscience has one commander and that's the Volk," right? They wouldn't see why that is a theological issue because they're not operating on that level. They're thinking in strictly either the racialist terms or the nationalist terms that you're talking about.
Right, right, because they just kind of look at some very they do look on a very basic political level too. I think one example that's brought up is like the social conservatism of National Socialists, or their views on, or some of their views on other races. Uh, if you take a poll of the people, I think this is something often brought up by people in our circles. But if you take a poll of the Allied soldiers who fought in World War II, a lot of them didn't have politically correct views on these issues. Um,
Right.
I mean, I think there was a Catholic philosopher speaking on the social issues side. He said, look, the reason why the National Socialists had these socially conservative views is because that was common sense back then. This was like, if you were a political movement that tried to preach the opposite of these views, you would not be able to win any votes. That was just a fact. That's just because that's not how people people were morally constituted back then. That's only changed in the past, what, 60 odd years?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of an oddly modernist perspective too. I mean, the idea that we are going to just view um, the straightforward profession publicly made to garner um, public support as a true reflection of somebody's belief, or even a true reflection of the ideology itself, I think is silly. And I think when we analyze modern politicians, and I've made this point many times, when we analyze modern politicians and the way their rhetoric operates, especially on the left, we would never state, and rightly so, that, oh, Joe Biden just really cares about mothers, and that's why, and free choice, and that's why he's in favor of abortion or something, right? Or that Joe Biden is actually a very good Catholic or something like that because he, is publicly a Catholic and met with the Pope, right? that just seems so silly in the modern context. But for some reason, when we look at history, we think that we can just see that those statements made by Hitler or other figures and say, oh, okay, well, there you go. The ideology was therefore Christian. And that's actually exactly what Carrier and some of these other guys who write books against my perspective say. They just interpret Christianity insanely broadly, and then they point to these specific public statements made by Nazi leaders and say, well, there you go. They wash their hands of it and say, I've proved it. It's like, well, no, that's not how this works. And that's not how history works, and it's especially not how a theological examination works of these views.
Because, like you said, they're not operating on that kind of higher theological or metaphysical level.
Right, and that's why they're
Um,
not. That's why they're not elect, and that's why Calvinism's true. I'm just kidding.
well, I mean, there's a lot wrong with this kind of National Socialist ideology, even from a kind of purely natural law perspective. I mean, the idea. I mean, in the first place, the idea when you make something other than God, and give that thing divine honors, that is objectively wrong because you're essentially turning a creature into the creator. You're essentially trying to make the creature act as the creator, and that's just not that is unjust because because justice is giving things what they are due, and if you give a creature what is due only to the creator, then that is unjust.
Right. I would say, I mean, you mentioned natural law theory again there.
Hmm.
I probably won't jive with you 100% on that just because I
Hmm.
lean more toward a divine command theory model of moral dictate than I
Hmm.
do natural law theory. I split with some of my reform counterparts on that. I've actually talked through DMs with, are you familiar with who Thomas Bogardus is? He's a Catholic philosopher
Hmm.
about this topic. And he's a natural law theorist. And at least from my very rudimental understanding of natural law theory, and I'm not an expert or anything like
Hmm.
that. It seems to me that natural law theory has the issue of that I also see somewhat in National Socialism of perceiving the natural reality and then drawing normative claims from the natural world, where I think we really should just be drawing them directly from
well
God's instruction.
that's not really I mean, you see that in scripture where Paul would say this is unnatural, this is
Yes,
and he would say that. I mean, that's
but I
clearly.
would say that that is a recognition of the the truth of the material reality, but he's not making the claim that it is immoral because it is unnatural, right?
I think
Because I think that
that's
if we do make that the axiom, that's obviously applicable to so many instances, right? I mean, there's tons
I
of things that
mean,
are moral good that are not necessarily materialistically natural.
well, see, that's the equivocation being had there. What do you mean by nature? Because different,
Right.
I'd imagine that someone like Thomas Aquinas would see nature very differently from someone like, say, I don't know, name a National Socialist. It's they're very they're going to be have very different when the National Socialist, or for that matter, the secular liberal, when they appeal to nature, they are appealing to a purposeless, causeless, natural order that that is materialistic. That there is there's nothing inherent. There's no inherent meaning to it. Human beings have no soul, and so on, and none of those assumptions apply to the Thomistic natural law, or even Aristotle's and Plato's understanding of natural law, because they would have seen the natural world as necessarily having been, by its nature, having been created by the eternal God, who is the source of all goodness, and who imbues creation with purpose.
Right.
And the idea within, you want to talk about the moral argument. Uh, Thomas Aquinas, the idea of natural law, uh, in Thomas Aquinas' says that we have these in his fourth and fifth ways. They are both kind of versions of the moral argument. The fourth way is essentially Thomas Aquinas saying, look, when we look around in nature, we see that there are different degrees of of goodness in natural things. Like we can order things hierarchically from bad to good, to better. But if goodness belonged to those things in essence, then we wouldn't be able to say that this is it. We wouldn't be able to do this because if it look at an example of humanity. Humanity belongs to us humans. Can you say that one human is more human than another? Well, does that even make sense? I don't think you can. You can say that one person is a better person than another, or better at being human, but it's not really the same thing.
Well, yeah, well,
And
that's the gap that I would have then, I guess, would be first, I'm a little bit skeptical of just the ordering that you're talking about from Aquinas. And I'm fairly familiar with that. But the gap that you're talking about, where when we begin to apply it to humans and humans' behavior and how we interact with nature, I guess is where I have the issue. And I'm not sure what the limiting principle on that is. So, for instance,
well, nature is defined in Aristotelian terms as an intrinsic principle, the intrinsic principle of the thing. So, for example, the it's with it's in so human part of human nature, what you would say is, for example, humans are rational animals because that is our essence as humans. And then what naturally follows from this, what is proper to humans, is that, for example, we have a sense of humor because rational animals can naturally have the faculty of reason, and so we can compare things and contrast things and find things amusing, find these
right.
kinds of amusing contrasts based on using our reason. And so we can say that it's a property of human nature to have a sense of humor. But that doesn't mean that every human person has a sense of nature, a sense of humor.
Of course.
Um, but it's kind of like how we say that dogs are four-legged animals, despite not
Right.
every dog actually having four legs.
Right.
It's
So,
something natural to them.
but everything you're talking about, and tell me, I don't want to grill you, so we can switch topics.
Oh,
But
hey, my entire channel talks about this
okay,
subject, so I'm
okay, good,
okay with you grilling me.
great, all right, sounds good. So the example that you just gave is perfect for I think what I'm trying to express. So in terms of just an observation of reality, and which is what I think Paul was doing when calling homosexuality a natural, and just fair. Fair statement here. Homosexuality is immoral. Okay, so
Mhm,
I'm not saying otherwise.
mhm.
Um, I believe he's making a recognition of the properties that you're talking about. In the same way that you recognize that it's natural for humans to have rational abilities, and therefore it's natural for humans to have a sense of humor. Okay, um, my issue is the jump from that sort of thing to the normative claim, and I think that what I'm looking for is the limiting principle that would say it's not immoral to not have a sense of humor just because it's not natural, right? Do you
Well,
see
I
what I'm
mean,
saying? Because I wouldn't derive from just the observation of something being natural or unnatural the morality of that. Like that's a
well,
normative claim.
okay. So to get into more the difference between moral goodness and natural goodness, we have to discuss what natural goodness is, right? So I think it might be helpful for you as an individual, uh, because Thomas Aquinas is the way his philosophy is set up. He starts with the things he has in common. He starts with things that we can see with our own eyes, and then works his way up to God, and then to show all these different things about God. And he works his way back down to the logical implications. Okay, since God exists, how does that affect our lives? I think that's sort of the layout of
Of
um,
course. Yeah.
of how a lot of Thomists operate.
I
But
I guess also.
I
Oh, sorry.
think
Go
for
ahead.
you though, since you and I agree on so much about God's nature, you being Reformed, I being Catholic, I think it might be helpful for you if I were to start first with how Thomists see God, and then how that relates to the natural world. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, I think so. I
Hmm.
think so. I don't
Hmm.
want to like spend all our
I want
time
to.
on it,
I want to.
but
I'll just try to go over this briefly.
okay.
Start with where we have something in common: divine command theorists and Thomistic natural law theorists. Um, so we would both agree that God is goodness itself. God is the good. God, in what Jesus said, uh, I think Jesus said to the rich man that no one is good but God. And what we take from that is that while you can say that a person is like a good person, God is just good simply. And the and so being the creator, everything that is good flows from him. And so you can have good instances of this and good instances of that, but the creator is goodness itself. Am I making sense so far?
Yes.
Hmm. Okay. So now, because he is uh, because he is goodness himself, anything that is created by him, uh, there could that deviates from that. There are varying degrees of goodness going all the way down. Now, people might ask, well, okay, well, where does evil come from? Well, evil in St. Augustine and the kind of Platonic philosophers that St. Augustine was contemporary with, they would say that evil is not a thing in itself; it's a state. It is. It's kind of like darkness is to light. What is darkness? Well, it's not a thing in itself. It's an absence of light. In the same way, evil is sort of an absence of goodness. It's sort of goodness that is wrongly oriented. And so when we say there is natural goodness and natural evil, we're referring to the orientation of that thing, being, towards the ultimate good, towards God. So now this doesn't mean that there's nothing moral about this so far, because what's good and bad for a thing is ultimately dependent on the nature that God gave it. So, for example, uh, if a lion were to attack a gazelle and kill it violently and eat up its flesh, that is bad for the gazelle, obviously, because the gazelle is oriented towards life, and that's obviously bad for its life. But it's good for the lion because the lion is also oriented towards life uh, in a teleological way. And it needs to consume the flesh of the gazelle in order to sustain its life. And there's nothing immoral about this. There's no moral principle being had here because the actors in this are not moral agents. So when we get to humanity, humans are a bit different because we are moral agents. And Thomas Aquinas would say we are moral agents because we can choose the good. We can participate in the good willingly, as opposed to by instinct or by a material kind of executive material participation. We participate in the good using our reason, and so the human goodness, the kind of moral goodness that you're describing, is simply the kind of natural, the goodness, the orientation of man to God, in the same way that the gazelle and the lion are oriented, but it's moral because it's human.
So
Does
can I
that
ask
make
you a
sense?
question?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it makes sense in the sense that I'm following it logically. Um, this kind of would be a callback also to what we talked about prior. I think human reason, um, you could probably show that human reason can have direct biological influences.
Of course, yes. I wouldn't deny that, but the whole of the
So
human
doesn't that
person,
actually then isn't the order of this then flipped? Because
not
then
not entirely, because immaterial things, first off, immaterial things are also ordered towards the good. For example, angels are all angels are oriented towards the good upon their creation, and they're basically minds with no component of bio. They're basically rational minds with no component of biology, according to Thomas Aquinas. And so they make one choice at the moment of the creation, whether to choose good or evil. And some fall, some ascend, as it were. Um, the and so what Thomas Aquinas would say is that human beings are sort of a mixed substance. They are one substance that is both material and immaterial. And in fact, they are in that sense they are very special in that they contain the entire cosmos within themselves. Like they represent the different aspects of creation. Represent all the different aspects of creation: the rational, spiritual, and material side, and also the different material aspects of creation too, all in one creature. And that's why we have a very special place in creation. Uh, now, as for the material affecting the spiritual, now Thomas, now that gets more into theology, actually, the theological side, and less on the kind of natural philosophy side. What a Thomist would say is that in the Garden of Eden, God gave us certain supernatural and preternatural gifts that elevated us beyond our nature. And this was the part of God's design, because God is not part of the natural order, because obviously he created the natural order. So he's supernatural, he's above nature. And so he's able to give us purposes and gifts that go beyond what normal humans can do, just like how a human could, fit out a lion with a jetpack. God can endow us with supernatural powers and preternatural powers. And one of them was the dictatorship of reason over concupiscence. Essentially, our first parents, Adam and Eve, had the ability to essentially control their own biological impulses, the same way you and I could control our own limbs. And that was it. And that was part of God's intention with creation. He didn't have to do this because these kinds of supernatural gifts are, well, they're gifts. They're not something natural to us. And we kind of we kind of lost them with original sin. And so now we have this struggle against our own bodies. We rebelled against God, so our own bodies rebel against us. And kind of and that it creates this kind of inverted hierarchy that we need God to sort of help us out of. Really, does that make sense?
yeah, I mean I think that's a good concise explanation. There's lots of places where I would want to like try to interject different
Of
things, but
course.
I also don't want to like just make this stream totally
Oh,
about, you know what I
yeah. I
mean?
mean, I understand the Reformed perspective is going to be very different because of the way you guys conceptualize original sin and
Well,
fallen,
that
the
yeah,
difference
yeah.
the difference between uh, uh, our parents' original state and fallen human nature.
Yes, it
The
does also mean though that we have a harder time with things like um, the problem of evil than you guys
Mhm.
do, and that's because of like the way we view the reality around us and its construction and God's sovereignty and things like that. I guess, but again, I don't, I don't want to have like a super long
Hey, I don't. Hey,
Calvinist.
if you don't want to do that, that's fine. I think we can
No, you're
stop
good.
here. I mean, this
No,
is a good place.
we can keep going. I think I'm also getting kind of out of my depth in terms of my
Mm,
understanding of um, uh, natural law theory. And so I will look into it more,
I
because I want
think.
to be able to kind of like show,
Hmm.
give my case more intelligently, and I don't want to just kind of like interject things, into what you're saying, or while you're saying it,
I will say
make some incorrect assumptions. You know what I mean?
I will say that a common two things to end this part of the conversation. The first is it's often a kind of straw man assumption to on the part of some Catholics to say that the Thomistic understanding of pure nature is something atheistic and materialistic. And this is not the case. So in Catholicism, there's this idea of natura pura, or pure nature. It's the idea that if God wanted to, he could have created a world and a human race that was that was a totally natural creation, and he didn't have to give us grace or any other supernatural or preternatural gifts. He could have had a perfectly happy human race that had no supernatural intervention whatsoever. But this is always um, a theoretical thing that God could have happened in his omniscience. Uh, this is and his omnipotence. And we say this mainly because we want to establish that God is free to give or take away grace. Because we would say that if we do not have this kind of concept of natural pura, then you make the supernatural. You start mixing the supernatural with the natural, and you start saying that God had to give us grace or something like that, and that's ridiculous in our view. And I think you would probably agree with that. God's grace is gratuitous. And furthermore, the state of pure nature, in the state of pure nature, humans would still worship God. They just wouldn't have supernatural knowledge of God. Things like biblical revelation. They would just have this purely natural philosophical understanding of God that would still sort of uh, they would still consider things like idolatry to be unjust, and they would still practice the Ten Commandments because we would say that the Ten Commandments are part of the natural law that we could know. That's the first thing. The second thing, and this has been pointed out by many critics of Thomism, but and I think it's correct that there's a lot more overlap between Thomistic natural law and divine command theory than people might want to assume. Because in Thomism, God is the highest end that human in nature is oriented towards. Because all of us, all parts of the human person are oriented ultimately towards God. And because of that, that includes our reason, faculties of reason, and our free will. So to will the good is to will what God commands. And so if God were to command us to do something, it is the morally just thing to do exactly what God commands. And so you can see there's a common ground between uh, uh, the Thomist view and the divine command theory, which is how, and this is, by the way, how Thomas Aquinas justifies, for example, God commanding the Israelites to wipe out certain sinners, sinful tribes in the Old Testament, because he says, well, God is sort of the universal common good, and so he has sort of this universal jurisdiction over all of humanity, and all mankind is bound to obey his commands. And so, he has the authority to authorize these kinds of things. And I guess the differences between Thomistic natural law theory and divine command theory are a lot finer than one would expect.
Yes, I think you're right in terms of like the pragmatic reality, when doing theological reasoning when we're trying to determine the morality of something. Considering that we would come to the same conclusions on things like homosexuality and things like that, regardless of that background, is telling. And it may be an indicator that both perspectives have truth in them. I think definitely most perspectives have truth in them. I guess I would more so say that I have seen the natural law perspective, and you would probably say this is a perversion of it. So it'd be a bug, not a feature, I guess. Used as a sort of justification for the proclamation of lots of behavior being immoral, that I wouldn't necessarily even consider it to be the case. And I see this sometimes in the political sphere in regards to various things. But I would say also that the natural law, that one pragmatic reality that I think does differ between Protestants like myself, who generally lean more toward the divine command theory idea, would be something like birth control. And our perspective on the use of that being moral or immoral within marriage versus the natural law theory perspective.
Well, I don't think. I mean, if you look at all, I don't think you will find. I mean, tell you what, if you can find me a Christian denomination before 1930 that said that birth control was morally illicit at any time, I would be very surprised.
Well, yeah, no, you're right. What I would say though is that most of the or a lot of the development in Protestant philosophy has actually been in like the last 100 years, frankly, especially when dealing with ethics. So that is, I would say, that is something that does come from a distinction between those two things.
But I think
And
that we have. I mean that's sort of. Yeah, I'm glad you. I'm glad you bring that up. Um, it's just kind of a reality that a large part of the reason why Catholics are against birth control isn't just like this kind of natural law theory.
oh,
Uh,
of course, there's
it's
tons of
it's also
pragmatic, yeah.
but it's not just pragmatic. It's also you have the pragmatic, you have the natural law theory, but it's also a kind of fidelity to the traditions passed down to us that St. Paul talks about. This idea that, well, we have sort of had this moral view since as far back as this is pretty close to apostolic teaching in our, if I remember correctly. I mean, I'd have again. I pray for your forgiveness because I don't have the exact quotes in front of me, but this is something that all Christians believed and preached for a very very long time, and so we don't want to change this teaching just because the world says it's okay.
I would agree, and I'd say that's an honorable perspective. I would say that something like birth control is fairly unique in the sense that its existence in the form that it is today is a modern phenomena.
Hmm.
And we're still trying to figure out, as Christendom, period, and you would agree with this in terms of Catholics, how our moral reasoning and biblical reasoning applies to it. I mean, like even with disputes within Catholicism on things like natural family planning, like I would say, I mean, like if you really
Uh,
wanted to be hardcore with it, you could very easily make the natural law case against natural family planning.
I don't
Just
think you can make the natural law case. I don't think it's very successful.
okay, well that's
And
fair
to be
enough. That's fair
honest,
enough.
I mean, you find a lot of very odd you will find a lot of very odd views about these kinds of things throughout Christian history. To be frank, there were a lot of church fathers who had some very strict views on sexuality that the church doesn't require us to uphold. Um, but but it still allows people to have those views.
Oh well,
Do
of
you,
course. I
do
mean,
you
I
understand?
would never say that it's immoral. Obviously, I would never say it's immoral for someone to not use birth control. I have a child, right? Um,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, but the issue of contraception is very it's one of those hard line things, kind of like a lot of other of these issues. It's not something that I think uh, I have come across Protestants in recent years who have very different views on birth control than you do. There's one Protestant that I'm friends with,
oh, definitely.
Named Todd Lewis,
Yep.
who is very much he uses a lot of the same reasoning that I've been using about this, that it's not something that Christians believed in before 1930, and so we shouldn't budge on this issue. Uh, but I think we don't really need to get into the weeds on that. I think, um, we but I am happy to clarify any more questions you might have about the faith and any kind of differences we have, because I know that you wanted to discuss some of that on this stream.
Yeah. No, I mean this has been good. I am curious because there was something on Twitter. I
Mhm.
don't remember what it was, but you replied to some sort of comment about when it came to the death penalty, and I think I mentioned this earlier before we had the
Mm.
stream. Um, there's several places, I guess, with when I'm looking for what the Catholic Church's position is on different topics that I go to, and what I'm most often referenced to go to is the Catechism. And when I go on Vatican websites, it's referred to as doctrine, if I remember correctly. Um,
Yeah, I mean, the thing about the catechism, though, is it's a restatement of Catholic dogma.
of
So
course,
places where
it doesn't
it's
originate from there. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, it's in the name. It's catechism. It's a tool for catechesis.
Yes.
It's not something like, let's say, Holy Scripture. Obviously,
Right. But
it's
so how would I, like, as a Protestant reading different parts of the Catechism about things like the death penalty, and I know that's been a recent change. Um,
mm,
would you consider the additional portion about the death penalty um, being, I don't want to use the wrong words, but like immoral, or should that the death penalty should be abolished? Um,
mm.
would you say that that is a not a proper reflection of Catholic history, and then therefore not um, doctrine?
So it depends on how you so Uh, so, so the Revised Catholic Catechism says, it says that recourse to the death penalty on the part of legitimate authority following a fair trial was long considered an appropriate response to the gravity of certain crimes and an acceptable, albeit extreme, means of safeguarding the common good.
Right.
Today, however, there is an increasing awareness that the dignity of the human person is not lost even after the commission of very serious crimes. In addition, a new understanding has emerged of the significance of penal sanctions imposed by the state. Lastly, more effective systems of detention have been developed, which ensure the due protection of citizens, but at the same time, do not definitively deprive the guilty of the possibility of redemption. Consequently, the Church teaches, in light of the gospel, that the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the human person, and she works with a determination for its abolition worldwide. Now, it cites the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the human person. It cites an address that Pope Francis made. I will say that in many of the addresses, he says this. He also says that life imprisonment is similarly inadmissible. So
Yikes.
and yeah, so
Yikes.
and not of, and he says it for the same reason, that it deprives people of hope. And he's not talking about hope in a theological context, but in a more kind of secular context uh,
Triple
too.
yikes.
Yeah. So the thing about the death penalty is that it is, you're right, it is a recent teaching, but the explicit, the very bold claim right there is unique to Pope Francis, because while Pope Francis's predecessors did say something similar to the effect of, well, in light of recent circumstances, the death penalty is inadmissible. They would also clarify that with, well, Catholics are free to disagree with us on this, and so
Right.
they make clear that this is a prudential judgment. And Pope Francis isn't really saying anything different. All he's doing is leaving out the part where he says, well, on this issue, it's a prudential judgment. But in other places, he says, well, it's okay if you disagree with me on an issue, but in a kind of general sense.
Right. So
so it's
what then, I guess, would
so
you do?
it's
I
kind
mean,
of
what's your
so
view
it's
on the death penalty, I guess, what I'm asking.
my view on the death penalty is that Edward Fazer is correct in saying that Pope Francis here, when Pope Francis and the Catechism is making the declaration that in light of these circumstances, so they're saying that in light of circumstances X, Y, and Z, the death penalty is inadmissible. A Catholic can agree to that while saying that we don't actually live in circumstances X, Y, and Z. In which case, this application of the principles that they're talking about does not apply. We don't
So,
disagree, so we do not disagree in principle what they are saying. We
right.
simply disagree that we live in these circumstances
So
that
that's
would
the
make the
second to
death
last
penalty
paragraph.
inadmissible. That
So
is correct.
so then the
It
final bit, would you say that the bit about she works with determination for its abolition worldwide has been contingent upon those circumstances, and those circumstances have not occurred?
well, I mean, I would say that this is a prudential judgment on the part of the papacy. This is not the high. This doesn't reach the level of a kind of a dogma that you must follow. This is not on the level. What it's saying is, now the principle behind it uh, uh, is dogma, but the application of the principle is a prudential judgment on the part of the church that we as Catholics are bound to respect, and with submission of will and intellect. But theologians are free to disagree with this
Okay.
if they have a good reason for this.
So
Um,
I know I just talked a lot about like trying to bring things to the theological level and not the
mhm.
practical, but I want to be a jerk and bring it to the practical for a second. Okay. All right. So I want to descend
Feel free.
into the filth here. So, um, the would you say though? Okay, so let's say what you're saying with the distinction between the those two things. Let's say that's the case, and that's the
Theological,
interpretation.
there's the
Um,
theological principle,
yes.
and then there's the practical application of the theological principle.
Would you say that if the church's stated application of the principle as it stands in the time period you live is the church is seeking with determination for its abolition worldwide,
Mhm.
that you then, as a Catholic, if you were seeking for more death penalty, would then therefore be in contradiction to the determination of the church?
Uh, the okay, that's a pretty interesting question.
I'm not trying to like
Um,
bum rush you with this or
I
anything.
mean,
You
it
know,
depends on how you mean what you mean by that.
okay, well, let's
If
say,
you
for
mean by
example, I
that,
know a lot of Catholics who think that the death penalty in Texas specifically ought to be given a lot more often for crimes that it currently is not. Like
mhm.
I know them. So would that, at least in my view, again, I'm still trying to understand how this works. At least in my view, it seems that that's just a statement that directly contradicts what the will of the church is at the time period they live.
Okay, but I mean, like I said, right? There are different levels of church statements, and each one is given a different level uh, of importance, right? So I can bring this up, but there's like five levels of church statements. Two of them two of them are dogma, of dogma or things that are very closely related to dogma. Those are the first two, and those are um yeah, okay, papal felt yeah, there's and those two are
I need a flow
you
chart.
can't.
I legitimately need a flow chart that I can whip out. I'm
I need to.
serious. I want it because I've been trying to get something like that. Uh,
I mean, there is an article. Why am I not able to bring this up? It's
I think
so
part of the
annoying.
reason I'm also so like solo fide, sola scriptura reformed is because it just seems so much less complicated. But I
Trust me, it's not less complicated in my view. I mean, in my view, this is a lot easier because, okay, I don't want to get into my
it's okay.
so sola scriptura Protestantism, but
I'm not also not ready to like make an argument for it or anything. So don't worry about that.
yeah, it's just I can't I cannot. There's something about it that even if I weren't Catholic, I could never be Protestant because of this problem I have with sola scriptura. But um,
You say you
we
don't
don't
think
need.
the KJV that Jesus descended from heaven and wrote the KJV, bro? Is that what you're saying? You
That
saying?
is not a that is not that is not an accurate representation of sola scriptura,
Oh,
good
I know, I know.
sir.
Oh my
But
god.
yeah, so the first level is statements which definitively put forward divinely revealed truths or dogmas in the strict sense, like, say, the doctrine of original sin, Christological dogmas, the immorality of directly and voluntarily killing an innocent human being, and so forth. These are things that you cannot disagree with. No legitimate disagreement is possible on these issues. The second level are statements which definitively put forward truths which are not revealed, but are closely connected to revealed truths, such as the immorality of euthanasia and the teaching that priestly ordination is reserved only to men. That's very. That is also something that does not allow for legitimate disagreement. The third level of statement is where you get interesting, where things get interesting, which are statements which are non-definitive but obligatory, and have the purpose of clarifying revealed truths. So these are statements that Catholics must accept with religious submission of will and intellect. However, given their non-definitive character, they're not preserved from error, meaning that if you as a learned Catholic um, decide to raise questions regarding the timeliness, the form, or even the contents of the magisterial interventions on these kinds of statements, then you are allowed to do so. But the kind of again, what religious submission of will and intellect mean is that the burden of proof is on you as a Catholic to show that this is there are any problems with this. It's not the burden is not on the church to do this because the church is the rule of faith. Um, the statement number four, which are statements of prudential sort, which require external obedience but not interior assent. So these are sort of statements about a good example of this would be the kind of statements found in the 17th century against Galileo, Galileo's cosmology. So these are things where the church rules has these rules of application on certain principle based on certain biblical principles, but it's not definitive, nor are supposed to internally assent to it. But there should be a kind of external obedience to it, simply because you don't want to cause scandal. And then finally, uh, the lowest level, the absolute lowest level, are statements of prudential sort on matters about which there may be a legitimate diversity of opinion among Catholics. And usually, um, the previous and usually you find popes will just outright come out and say, well, there's a legitimate diversity of opinion on this matter, and you're free to discuss this and disagree with me on this. they'll just come out and say that in their statements, um, which is very. And usually there's a lot of clarity on these issues. And when there isn't, usually it gets resolved. If it's not resolved by this pope, it's usually resolved by the next pope who comes along on these things. Uh, does that make? Am I making any sense?
I mean, you're listing a lot of categories that I think are applicable. I guess my question would be, and this is why I joke, but I'm actually serious. Why I would need a flowchart would be so I can assess these things as a filthy layman Protestant. Um,
Well, I
how
mean,
do
the issue
I
is
do that?
okay. So the issue right now is that up until Pope Francis, it seemed as though the issue of the death penalty's legitimacy, the legitimate application of the death penalty fell under the fifth category, which is prudential judgments that you are free to disagree with the Pope on, or
Exactly.
the Church on.
Yes.
But with Pope Francis, it seems as though he is placing them higher.
Right.
Now, a lot of people, Catholics, will say, well, they're now official definitive dogma, which is kind of a ridiculous position, in my opinion, because there's no evidence. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that Pope Francis would do this, and it would definitely contradict like everything that every pope up until Francis had said. And I don't think it's charitable to interpret Pope Francis as being out of contin- out of continuity with his predecessors. In the same way, it's not charitable to take one book of the Bible and say, "Oh, it's not. It contradicts this earlier book of the Bible," because as a Christian, you're supposed a faithful hermeneutic would be to try and reconcile apparent contradictions like that. Um, the but on the other hand, Pope Francis is definitely, he's allowing for it seems like he's trying to raise the level from the fifth category to the fourth category, where there's an expectation of a certain external obedience at this point.
So is there when these statements are made, they don't come with an explicit, we are now moving this or this, I guess I don't want to say doctrine. We are now moving this take
It,
from level 5 to level 4, right?
Usually it's in the language, like it's
Right.
not, they don't
Like you mentioned
explicitly
before with
say it.
5. So,
Like
but if
they
it's
will
in the
say,
language, then it's 4 now,
yeah,
right?
it's in the it's in the late, yeah, and that's the thing, right? If you have someone like Pope Francis, who I mean, some people will argue that he speaks rather ambiguously and he doesn't clarify things.
That's true.
Um,
That's true.
and so he'll say some very outrageous things on an airplane interview that
Don't we all?
that don't that seem to contradict what previous church teaching says and what even he says in other contexts. And then this creates this wild controversy in Twitter spaces, and you have some people saying, "Oh, you go against the Pope, that means you're a heretic," and then you have people going, "Well, all this means that Pope Francis isn't the Pope, that it's actually secretly Pope Benedict the whole time."
Yeah. Yeah.
It's kind of it, but I think that's
And
more
now
of
it's
it.
no one. Now I
Now
guess
it's,
all those people have to be Sedevatianists or something, or
yeah,
what?
state of a contest. Oh, don't get me started on those.
Sedevacantist. I'm sorry, I
Yeah,
can't.
don't get me started on
No,
that
no, 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 no. I
controversy.
don't want to. Please, please don't. Please don't. Please don't.
But I
But
mean, the point is that we've
what you're
already
telling
had.
me helps.
Yeah, I mean, it's look, right? We've had these problems in the church since the very beginning. You've always had people who try to confuse the faithful, start up controversy, and it doesn't help that we're all human, and so we're all imperfect. But even the Pope, papal infallibility doesn't mean that the Pope can't make mistakes. because he obviously can. Uh, uh, the and obviously we as Catholics can have differences of opinion on different levels of doctrine. Um, I guess the Catholics who try to say that papal kind of the papal authority, papal infallibility means you can just shut off your brain and you don't have to reason about these things. You can just mindlessly follow the Pope. Those Catholics are wrong. Obviously, you still have to use your brain if you're a Catholic, just as much as you have to use your brain if you're a Protestant or an Orthodox or any other
Sounds
religious
like you
faith.
probably have to use it more to sort it all out.
Uh, I
Sorry,
mean,
that I'm just picking at you. I'm sorry.
I
I'm
don't
sorry.
really think. I mean, if you uh, if you have to use your brain more, well, I don't know. I mean,
I'm not being serious, Will.
I
I'm not
mean,
being serious. I'm just joking, dude.
no, no.
It's all right.
I mean, how is it? I think Christ once said, do not point to the toothpick in your brother's eye if you have a plank in yours." Tell me, are there no controversies of great importance within reform circles, or am I mistaken?
Absolutely not. We're all one happy family, and we agree on everything. Absolutely.
Of course,
Yeah.
maybe I should give the reform circles a try.
Oh
Uh,
man.
I mean, no, no, I am somewhat familiar with the kinds of controversies going on, between the kind of Reformed Thomists and the Reformed Scholastics, and the people like James White who are very much
Yeah.
against that view.
Yeah.
Well, that is just one example of a controversy. I've also remember like the biblicists versus the confessionalists and controversy stuff,
Yeah.
all that. You know, these things happen because people have limited knowledge. But I believe that if we follow the rule of faith, which is the church and the Holy Scriptures and the traditions handed down to us, and we all orient ourselves towards God and with prayer and show charity to one another in these debates, that the truth will come out because the Holy Spirit will be guiding us then.
I would agree in terms of definitely the prideful component is a huge shutdown in terms of these types of conversations, and that is
Mm-hmm.
one of my issues. Although I would align with White on a lot of things, I think that he's pretty pompous in some ways that he handles stuff. But again, that's not obviously not limited to him in these circles, especially.
Oh gosh, yeah, no. I if only James White was the only pompous Christian on the planet.
I think
Uh,
it's interesting. Like the question of pride too is fascinating. Given to circle back to some of the political stuff that we're dealing with, also is that I think I think pride is a pretty big influence on people's perspectives, especially with things like forgiveness and justice, like we were talking about earlier. And at what level, are we just being prideful or actually being faithful in our attempt to avoid capitulating to evil? Right. I think that's a very, very thin line to walk sometimes, and
hmm.
I'm not going to pretend like I'm always on one side or the other for sure. But I do think it is kind of a hint, more than a hint. I think it's kind of clear in Christ's character that generally leaning on the side of grace is going to get you much further uh, in terms of being godly than leaning on sort of like your own prideful doctrinal stances.
Hmm. I mean, I'm of two minds on this, but I have to say that I sort of agree with you a little bit more, simply because you're right about this. Like, let's take for example, I don't to use a non-biblical example. Uh, let's from a Catholic work, Lord of the Rings. The example of Smeagol slash Gollum from the Lord of the Rings. The main character Frodo is, Gollum is this kind of goblin-like creature, and the main character Frodo, he spares Gollum from despite Gollum's vindictiveness and wrongdoings. Frodo spares Gollum out of pity for him because he sees that Gollum is, despite his evil, a creature that suffers greatly.
You got to be careful with the
And
Lord of the Rings spoilers. My wife is listening to this, and she has not read the books or watched the movies, so tread
I'm
lightly.
sorry. I'm sorry. Well, in the end, you could argue that, in the end, Gollum does Gollum does try to backstab Frodo, but but what happens in the end, it shows that God, who in Lord of the Rings, the natives call him Eru Iluvatar, but he's essentially God. God works things out so that even though Gollum did these evil acts, God was able to use them to bring about a happy ending for all the characters.
Interesting.
Uh,
I didn't know that
so
there was an actual explicit God figure in Lord of the
yeah,
Rings. I'm not as versed.
in the Cimmerillion, I mean, there's actually a reference to it, but because the thing is, the Lord of the Rings is supposed to take place in a kind of antediluvian age, the world before the flood. So but the world itself is very Catholic, uh, because that was the leaning of the author. And
Maybe
in
that's
fact,
why I'm more of a Chronicles of Narnia guy.
but yeah, Eru Iluvatar, Eru Iluvatar is referenced throughout the book as this kind of force that it's not a deistic force at all. It's very much a force of divine providence, the one that works with and it works within creation to bring about a good end. And and it's contrasted with kind of the forces of Morgoth and Sauron, who these kinds of demonic figures who impose their will upon creation to try to make it bend towards their ends. What God does in the Lord of the Rings is his providence is very gentle. He takes things that he because he's in such control over everything, he can take events that were meant to be acts of rebellion against him and use them for his own ends to bring about the end that is just and good.
As a
Uh,
as a Calvinist leaning person, I like the sovereignty angle.
oh yeah, it's very. Where do you think Calvinists got it from? They got it from the
God,
poets.
the
They got it
Bible.
from the. They got it from. I mean, we get it from the Bible too. So, to be fair, we get it from the Bible too.
Oh man.
Uh,
Do we want to take some? I don't know how many people are watching. I'm not sure it's a ton, but if people want to ask questions, it'd be kind of fun to take
yeah,
some.
boomerism. Yeah.
Oh, am I
Uh,
highlighting that myself? Oh, you're doing that. Okay. I,
I
I
did
clicked it
that.
at the same time, and I was like, whoa.
So yeah. I see that my friend Emperor of Ira is in chat. Hello, friend. I will be seeing you. I hope to see you Friday for our little Dungeons and Dragons group.
Ooh,
Um,
Carlsbad should have been here. I've talked to Carlsbad before on a Twitter space, long time ago. That was early HHC lore. You gotta have all the background knowledge for that one.
let's see. I think there's a lot of people who tag Christianity onto their radical politics to justify them because they see it as based rather than building their politics from Christianity.
Yep.
Would you agree? Yep, yeah,
Yep.
that is
Big
true.
agree. Big agree.
Yeah, I mean, but to be fair, Christianity, when it's properly practiced, is based, and
True.
that's it's just not conducive to a person's prideful attitude. God wants us to be humble
Yeah.
before him. Submission to hierarchy and all of that.
I've been trying to push the needle of the definition of based more toward just the definition of Christ-like. I think that'd be an improvement for everything.
Oh,
Um,
certainly, yeah, but base just means cool. you know.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. That's true.
Yeah. Let's see. Isn't all the important topics are in the Bible itself? Well, I would definitely agree that they are
Yeah.
at least implicit in the Bible. Certainly, if it's brought out of the Bible by commentaries, by and very intelligent theologians, church councils. But yeah, I believe in the kind of totem. I believe it's called the total theory of Scripture, which is that tradition and everything in tradition is in Scripture, and everything in Scripture is in tradition. Although implicitly, it might be implicit in one or the other. Um, it's a very different view from the kind of partial view of that, where part of the revelation is in Scripture and part of it is in the tradition,
Can I
which
can I
is.
like sort of
Mhm.
bum rush you with a silly question real quick?
Oh, sure, sure.
Is your perspective on contraception influenced by the story of Onan?
I would say yes, actually. It's definitely influenced by the story of Onan. Um, Although, as a Catholic, I would agree with some people that it doesn't explicitly say, and this is why contraception is immoral because Onan did this and God punished it. But it's not everything in the Bible has to be explicitly laid out in those stark terms. I mean, the word Trinity doesn't appear in the Bible. That doesn't mean God isn't a Trinity in the Bible. You know what I mean?
Yes, no, I agree with you on the Trinity bit, but I'm just
Mhm.
curious on that because that does have some. That is one example of something we had talked about earlier. That kind of like how Protestants may interpret Scripture and like the level of how explicit it has to be.
I am
Um,
well aware of all the things like different people will have. There it's a difficult thing because human knowledge is limited, and we all bring to the table our assumptions when we interpret Scripture, and so we have to hash that out. When we talk to when I talk to people with a different tradition, I have to hash that out in terms of and bring it back to first principles of theology, like who are we to interpret the Bible with our assumptions? That's we have to go back to these kinds of first principles before we arrogantly decide based on our opinions and that we can use the Bible to justify any whole thing. I think you would understand that because
yes,
there's
yeah,
so many people, even pagans and atheists, who will take scripture verses out of context and interpret them wildly. Like, holy cow, you would just find the wildest things in there. It's I don't want to get into that though because that would drive me up a wall just talking about it.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, at least he's theologically sound for the most part. Yeah, I would agree. There's a lot of places where a Reformed Christian and a Thomistic Catholic Christian would agree on. We would probably agree on a lot more if we were to talk about it in detail. Yeah, pretty sure he's not a troll. I'm whatever else he is, he's not a
Well,
troll. I
this
don't
has
think so.
implications of like your essence and being and all kinds of Thomistic,
He's certainly
whatever.
sarcastic. He
Yeah. So
certainly has a
listen,
well-developed sense of wit.
just because I do troll does not mean my nature is that of a troll. All right. So I'm separating, I don't know, the substance or whatever. So
Yeah, I mean
yeah,
it's all Thomistic and stuff.
exactly. Boom. Exactly.
uh, uh,
QED.
okay, yeah. So I'm hoping that Dave is still watching. That maybe he'll change his mind on you.
I'll
But if
talk
he
to
does,
him. I'd love to have. I asked him to have a conversation with me publicly because I was kind of tired of DMing him, and he got mad at me because he felt like I was not charitably interpreting him in DMs. And I kind of thought after he did, decline talking to me publicly that he would just like that would be it, and then he just sort of goes off on me on a live stream where I can't defend myself. So I'm
Well, I
still a little
mean,
salty about that, but I will. I have forgiven him. I'll say that I have forgiven him, and I will love to have a public discussion with him.
well, that's very nice of you. I just hope, yeah, I would prefer if more people were friends despite disagreements like this. Um, there's a, it's a, and I would say that this is essential. I don't think that you and Dave necessarily disagree on terms of principle. This is a prudential judgment, kind of like how I
Yes.
might have a disagreement about the application of the death penalty to certain circumstances.
Yeah.
You and Dave have a difference of opinion on when is it wise for a Christian to uh, make these kinds of public statements.
Yes. There is definitely a distinction between my disagreement with Dave and my disagreement with Pedro or Oren. 100%. I think my disagreement with Pedro and Oren was much deeper and theologically based, and I think my disagreement with Dave was mostly a question of
Hmm.
pragmatics. But I don't know that for sure because I wasn't able to have a long format conversation with him about it. So, uh,
I mean, yeah, I think so. Though I don't know if Pedro or Oren, to be fair, I don't think if you got them onto a live stream that you would be able to get them to say, "Well, no, you can't." No, Christ is wrong when he says to forgive when he forgave those people. I don't think they would be able to say
no,
that
no.
honestly.
Yeah, of course. I guess it was just more so like, and this gets into more questions of the theology component, but I guess the statement "there's nothing Christian about forgiving someone who tries to murder your son" just really stuck in my craw, and I think for pretty good reason. And that kind of leads me to think that's probably a deeper disagreement than what I have with Dave, because I don't think he would affirm that statement.
Okay, all right.
But that's enough internet drama. We don't need to go all into that. Somebody's
Oh, of
asking what's
course.
my favorite Narnia book. You can bring that one up. I think that's the last comment up there.
Yeah, yeah.
Good question. So, I like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but it's not my favorite way of articulating the atonement because it's more of a Christus Victus thing and less of a like a penal substitutionary thing. But I like that it's the book that contains the most like explicit characterization of Christ, which I think is cool.
I mean,
Um,
there is a certain
go ahead.
penal substitution in that the Aslan uses this. Aslan is dying, is taking like the punishment of for Edward's. I forgot his name. Edward. Is it Edward
It's
or
Ed. I think it's
Edgar?
Edmund.
Edmund,
That's
Edmund,
what it
yeah.
is. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. It's been years since I read the books. You'll have to forgive me. Edmund, yeah. Edmund is going to be executed as a traitor, and in Aslan, who is Lion Jesus, he is substituting himself for Edmund, despite being innocent
That is
of the
true.
crime.
That
So
is
it's
true.
so there is, I think there, you could make a case that there is an element of substitutionary atonement, that kind of penal substitution. What I don't really like about that is they're having the Satan figure be the judge of this case.
Yes, he holds Christ to account, or the figure of Christ, which is Aslan, to account to his own law. And so the Satan being and I know biblically is the accuser, it does seem, at least in the book, that
Yeah,
Aslan is sort of reluctant almost that, oh, now I have to like be accountable to the rules that my father put in place, like the deep magic or whatever it's called. So that's a little
Yeah,
sus,
but
but
there's a
you can
but
only
yeah,
translate these things so accurately into fiction. Like
yeah,
it's
yeah,
just,
and
yeah.
I think it's somewhat mitigated by the fact that there is a deeper magic that Satan or the White Witch was ignorant of, that says that he'll come back to life if he
Yeah.
sacrifices himself on the part of another, which actually speaks to another theory of the atonement, which was the ransom theory, which is
Right.
which is the idea that a lot of the church fathers had, that God did had the atonement to win us away from Satan, and then tricked Satan, sort of,
Yeah.
because he made this kind of deal of, I'll give you Christ if you give me humanity. Oops, you don't actually have Christ because you never had humanity to begin with.
Haha.
that kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
it's a kind of a tricksy thing, but
That's definitely my
uh,
least favorite atonement theory, I think,
well, I mean,
frankly.
I think it's a very good. I personally like it because it reinforces God's sovereignty. Satan never had a hold over, it had a right to anything, and so
Mm.
God isn't doing anything unjust in kind of quote unquote cheating him,
But it's a
because
little
he
bit
never.
contradictory if your penal substitutionary theory, strictly holds God as the judge, and it's not like, you know what I mean. If the accuser isn't the,
Well, say yeah.
I
I
guess it gets
mean,
confusing.
well, yeah, yeah. Satan is like the I don't believe exactly in the penal substitution theory, so that might be something
Okay.
that a difference of opinion between us. But if I were to try to put it into those terms, Satan is less shouldn't be the judge. He should be more like the prosecutor of the case, since he's the accuser, and Jesus is sort of like the defense lawyer, and God the Father is the judge.
Right. I guess I would say if there was not a prosecution, though, that the deep magic would still stand. Is, I guess, would be my point.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, there's always like a limit to allegories.
Yeah, of
That's
course.
actually why I think that might be why Tolkien once said that he doesn't like them very much.
That's probably, yeah. That's maybe a difference in like also how it came out in their fiction. I haven't read the Narnia books in a long time, but I recently watched the Prince Caspian movie, and I was thinking about this because I had never thought about it from the theological perspective, and it really struck me because in that one, the witch is already defeated, and they're fighting worldly powers and principalities, and they get to a point where they decide and almost resurrect the witch to be able to make a deal with them because they're so concerned with worldly oppression. And I felt like that was very applicable to kind of what I see and what I'm experiencing in my interactions with people, even politically, where my concern is that the principalities that are descending upon us will actually cause us to do something like resurrect the witch. And that's kind of
Okay. Yeah, I would definitely agree. That's a very good point, actually. Um, last couple of questions from my friend Emperor Baira. First one being, why do you think? Uh, I think he meant, what do you think of how I can apply these Christian politics to my nations? Because this young, full disclosure, this young man is actually from the Philippines.
okay.
And he says, because have a culture war, but it's not based on whiteness that much. We chose to fight old evil to fight new evil. How sad.
Oh, okay.
It's it.
Um,
So how would you, in a kind of non-American context, what would you say? What advice would you give to this young man in applying Christianity to the politics of his nation?
I guess because I don't know a lot about like any type of cultural conflict or conflict in the Philippines. I'd say that you can really never go wrong by just trying to be as Christ-like as possible in all of your responses to people. And when you are reacting to things, because we need to react to things as believers who are living and making moral decisions, everything that we do needs to be ran through a filter of Christ-likeness. And it's like sort of a silly old moniker, but like, what would Jesus do? That's a very basic idea, but that's what we as Christians are called to do. It's like, well, would a Christian react in this way to this scenario? Would Christ extend grace to this person in the way that he interprets what they're saying, right? That I don't think you can ever go wrong with, regardless of what context you live in culturally and what conflicts you're having.
Sound advice. Well, um, that was the last of our questions. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and I'm so happy to have on HHC. Maybe we could have another stream sometime where I bring on some more Protestants on here, and we just have a discussion, and you gang up on me.
Yeah. No,
Maybe.
I had a good
No,
time though. This is fun. I'd love to do this again. So thanks for having me on, Will. And is your I call you Will, or what's your channel name again?
you can
Applied
call.
Virtue.
Well, yeah, my channel name is Applied Virtue, and the name I go by is William. It's a
Okay.
pseudonym, mind you, but I prefer it.
Okay, gotcha. And you know the general area I live. So if you ever did want to do something in person and you're in the general area I live, let me know. And then you can
Okay.
also be privy to the sacred information that is what is my racial background, because you'll get to meet me in real life.
Uh, okay. Okay. Sure. Sure. Okay. Uh. Thank you for coming on, man. It was nice talking to you, and many more conversations to be had. What are you planning on doing in the future?
Good question. So I don't know if you guys have seen, I have been posting sort of graphical meme format versions of different parts of my pinned Twitter thread. And I know we didn't talk a ton about it, which I think is I'm grateful for, because this has been a great discussion. But my pinned Twitter thread is where all of my information on like sort of proving the premise of my account is, and I've been converting those, or actually more realistic, my wife has been converting those into beautiful graphics that can be shared online and distributed in all kinds of Telegram chats to upset people and cause good discussions. So those have been, she's been creating those, and we've just been going through one post at a time and getting those put out there. So once those are complete, I'm not sure what I'll do next. Maybe I'll turn my attention to a different historical figure or something. I did try to start an Instagram with those graphics, and I got banned immediately because I had anything to do with Hitler. But there you go. That's my
Yeah,
that's my pinned thread right
this is
there.
his pinned thread. Yeah, he has this long pinned thread about quote after quote of the National Socialists' non-Christian views, which are expressed in various quotes from various passages of books, from speeches, and so on.
And if you guys
Uh,
would, if you guys hate reading Twitter threads like I do, and you think it's just totally cancered, you don't need to do the little unroll thing and get it to make a printout. If you go to my Discord links in my bio on Twitter, you can look in the general chat in the pin thread, and there's a PDF of that entire thing. So it's so much more consumable, and you can also send it to people, and it looks impressive to have like a 60-page document of research into something like this. So.
Definitely, yeah, it certainly is. Um, Nice talking to you, and I hope we get to talk again.
Yeah,
This
for sure,
is
Will.
all right. This is Will from Applied Virtue signing out. Have a nice day, everyone. God
Yeah.
bless.
God bless.